Nobody expected the woman carrying two steaming cups of coffee to change the course of Operation Skyfall. Lieutenant Kestrel Nighthawk. Thorne had been walking past the briefing room when Captain Morrison's voice cut through the corridor like shattered glass. "I need someone with rotorcraft experience. Now." The urgency in his tone made her pause, coffee cups trembling slightly in her hands. Through the half-open door, she could see the tactical display painting red warnings across Afghanistan's eastern frontier. 4 Marines were trapped behind enemy lines, their extraction window closing like a steel trap in exactly 47 minutes. The room buzzed with testosterone and desperation. Major Phillips was shaking his head, muttering about weather conditions that would ground even seasoned pilots. The sandstorm rolling across the Hindu Kush had visibility dropping to near zero, winds gusting at 60 knots. "It's suicide," someone whispered, but Thorne had flown through worse, much worse. Her mind flashed to that night over Fallujah 3 years ago, when she'd guided a crippled Blackhawk through a maze of enemy fire and mechanical failure, bringing home 12 wounded soldiers who shouldn't have survived. She knocked on the door frame, coffee still balanced in her hands. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward her, most registering mild annoyance at the interruption. Captain Morrison looked up from his maps, expecting another logistics officer or intel analyst. Instead, he saw a woman in desert fatigues, her shoulder bearing the faded wings of a combat pilot, her dark eyes holding something these men hadn't seen in weeks: absolute certainty. "Sir," she said, voice steady as mountain stone, "I heard you needed someone with rotorcraft experience." A few officers exchanged glances. Someone stifled a laugh. She'd been grounded for 6 months after the incident that nobody talked about, relegated to transport duty and coffee runs. But Morrison saw something in her stance, the way she held herself like a coiled spring ready to launch. The tactical display continued its ominous countdown. 43 minutes. The trapped Marines' radio had gone silent 20 minutes ago, their last transmission a desperate whisper about enemy movement closing their position. In the suffocating silence of the briefing room, Thorne set down the coffee cups with deliberate precision. The small ceramic clink echoed like a decision being made. "What's your flight time?" Morrison asked, though something in his gut already knew the answer would surprise him. The woman standing before him wasn't just another pilot. She was something far more dangerous, a pilot with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Outside, the Afghan wind howled like an omen, but Thorne's eyes never wavered from the tactical display showing 4 American lives hanging in the balance. Morrison was about to discover that sometimes salvation comes disguised as someone bringing coffee. Sometimes heroes hide in plain sight, waiting for their moment to remind the world who they really are. Nighthawk was ready to fly again. The coffee grew cold as destiny stirred. Thorne's service record lay buried beneath layers of bureaucratic shame and whispered allegations. Reckless endangerment, the official report had stated. Violation of direct orders. But the 12 Marines she'd pulled from that burning building in Ramadi knew a different truth. They knew Nighthawk had flown into hell itself to bring them home, threading her Blackhawk through a gauntlet of RPGs and small arms fire that should have turned them all into scattered metal and memory. Major Phillips cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Lieutenant Thorne has been restricted to non-combat operations for—" Morrison raised a hand, silencing him. The captain studied Thorne's face, nodding the small scar above her left eyebrow, the calloused hands of someone who'd gripped collective sticks through impossible situations. More importantly, he saw the hunger in her eyes, the desperate need of a caged eagle watching the sky. "Talk to me about the weather," Morrison said simply. Around the room, officers shifted uncomfortably. They'd been discussing the storm for 20 minutes, agreeing it was impenetrable. Thorne stepped closer to the meteorological display, her finger tracing the satellite imagery like she was reading scripture. "Sandstorms moving northeast at 30 knots, but there's a corridor here," she pointed to a narrow band of clearer air. 15 minutes wide, maybe 20 if we're lucky. Low-level approach through the valley, stay under the worst of it. Her voice carried the confidence of someone who'd navigated through nature's fury before. "It's not impossible, it's just inadvisable." Several pilots shook their heads. Lieutenant Colonel Hayes, a veteran of 3 tours, spoke up. "That valley's a shooting gallery. Taliban have been using it to funnel supplies. We'd be flying into a hornet's nest in zero visibility." His concern was legitimate, born from watching good pilots die in similar conditions. Thorne nodded, acknowledging the danger. "Yes, sir, it is, but those Marines don't have 24 hours for this storm to pass. They've got 38 minutes before their position is overrun." She turned back to Morrison. "I can thread that needle, Captain. I've done it before." The room fell silent except for the hum of electronics and the distant rumble of thunder. Morrison found himself weighing impossible choices: risk 1 pilot to save 4 Marines, or sacrifice the 4 to preserve the 1. But something in Thorne's posture told him this wasn't about mathematics. This was about redemption, about proving that Nighthawk could still fly when others feared to leave the ground. Outside, the first drops of rain began spattering against the windows, harbingers of the storm rolling across the mountains. Time was bleeding away like water through cupped hands, and 4 American soldiers waited for salvation that might never come. In that moment, Morrison made the decision that would either resurrect a pilot's career or end it forever. The briefing room transformed into a hurricane of activity. Thorne found herself at the center of controlled chaos, her grounding suddenly forgotten as seasoned officers deferred to her tactical assessment. She moved to the terrain display, her fingers dancing across the touchscreen as she plotted waypoints through terrain that looked more like the surface of Mars than anything hospitable to human life. "Primary extraction zone here," she indicated a ridge overlooking the Marines' last known position. "But if it's compromised, secondary's this clearing 2 clicks northwest, tertiary's the river bend, but that's getting into Taliban territory." Her voice carried the methodical precision of someone who'd planned hundreds of similar missions, each one a careful balance between audacity and survival. Chief Warrant Officer Rodriguez, the unit's most experienced crew chief, stepped forward. "Ma'am, what bird you want to take?" His question held subtle respect. Rodriguez had worked with enough pilots to recognize the real deal when he saw it. Thorne had been studying the aircraft manifest, considering options like a chess master contemplating her opening move. "The 47 Delta," she said without hesitation. "She's got the heaviest armor package and the most recent maintenance cycle." It was a choice that spoke to experience. Newer pilots might have chosen the faster aircraft, but Thorne understood that survivability mattered more than speed when flying through a gauntlet of enemy fire. Morrison approved with a curt nod. Rodriguez prepped the bird full combat load. He turned to Thorne, his expression serious as a funeral. "Lieutenant, I need you to understand something. This isn't about proving anything. This is about bringing those Marines home. If the situation looks impossible, you abort. 4 dead Marines is tragic. 5 dead Americans is unnecessary." Thorne met his gaze without flinching. "Understood, sir. But those boys aren't dying on my watch. Not if I can prevent it." There was something in her voice that reminded Morrison of why she'd earned the call sign Nighthawk in the first place. Birds of prey don't abandon their hunt just because the weather turns ugly. The clock on the wall showed 31 minutes remaining. Somewhere in the mountains, 4 Marines were counting heartbeats and ammunition, hoping that help was coming before the darkness claimed them permanently. Thorne gathered her flight gear, muscle memory guiding her hands through preparations she'd performed thousands of times. But this time felt different. This time carried the weight of redemption balanced on rotor blades and prayer. As she walked toward the flight line, the wind caught her hair, and for just a moment she looked like the warrior she'd always been underneath the shame and bureaucratic chains. Nighthawk was about to prove that some birds never forget how to soar, even when the world tries to clip their wings. The Blackhawk sat on the tarmac like a sleeping predator, its rotors drooping in the stillness before the storm. Chief Rodriguez had outdone himself in the brief preparation time. The aircraft bristled with defensive systems, door gunners' positions loaded with enough ammunition to level a small building. Thorne ran her hands along the fuselage during her pre-flight inspection, feeling the aircraft's readiness like a pilot's sixth sense. "She's ready to hunt, ma'am," Rodriguez called out over the increasing wind. His crew had worked with mechanical precision, understanding that perfection in preparation could mean the difference between coming home and becoming a memorial plaque. Thorne nodded, continuing her inspection with the thoroughness of someone who knew that overlooked details killed aircrew. Her co-pilot emerged from the operations center, flight suit partially zipped, helmet tucked under his arm. Warrant Officer Marcus Ghost Chen had volunteered when he heard Nighthawk was flying the mission. Unlike many of his peers, he'd never bought into the whispered stories about her alleged recklessness. He'd read the classified after-action reports, seen the gun camera footage from Ramadi. What others called reckless, he recognized as calculated aggression performed under impossible circumstances. "Evening, Nighthawk," Chen said, using her call sign with deliberate respect. "Heard we're flying into hell tonight." His casual tone masked genuine concern, but also unwavering trust. Good co-pilots didn't question their aircraft commander's decisions in front of the crew. They supported them and provided alternatives when necessary. Thorne secured her helmet, the familiar weight settling onto her head like an old friend returning. "Hell's where Marines go when they need picking up, Ghost. We're just the taxi service." Her attempt at humor carried an undercurrent of steel. She'd flown into worse conditions, but never with so much riding on the outcome. This wasn't just another mission. It was her chance to prove that the brass had been wrong about her, that Nighthawk still had talons sharp enough to cut through enemy resistance. The tactical radio crackled with updates from the forward observers. The Marine situation was deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces had been moving through the valley all afternoon, converging on the Americans' position like wolves circling wounded prey. Latest intelligence suggested at least 40 Taliban fighters, possibly more, armed with RPGs and heavy machine guns. Rodriguez finished securing the rescue equipment, medical supplies, and ammunition. His crew moved with practiced efficiency, understanding that every second counted. The door gunners, Sergeant Williams and Corporal Jackson, tested their weapon systems one final time. Both men had flown with various pilots over multiple tours, but tonight felt different. Tonight, they were flying with a legend who'd been forced into premature retirement. As Thorne climbed into the pilot's seat, muscle memory guided her through the startup procedures. Her hands moved across switches and controls with unconscious precision, each action performed thousands of times in training and combat. The engines began their familiar whine, building power that would soon carry them into the teeth of the storm. Outside, lightning flickered across the horizon like artillery fire, nature preparing its own barrage against their mission. "Tower, Nighthawk 7-7 requesting immediate departure for extraction mission," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was the moment of truth, when grounded pilots either proved their worth or confirmed everyone's worst fears about their capabilities. The tower's response carried understanding of the mission's urgency. "Nighthawk 7-7, cleared for immediate departure. Godspeed." Simple words that carried the weight of 4 lives hanging in the balance and one pilot's shot at redemption. Thorne pulled collective, and the Black Hawk lifted into the darkening sky, rotors biting air as they climbed toward destiny waiting in the mountains. The aircraft rose into twilight that looked more like the end of the world than the beginning of a rescue mission. Below, the forward operating base shrank into a collection of lights fighting against the encroaching darkness. Thorne banked northeast, following the heading that would take them through the storm corridor she'd identified. The weather radar painted an ominous picture ahead, but her eyes remained focused on the narrow band of opportunity threading between the worst of the tempest. "Ghost, talk to me about fuel," she called to her co-pilot over the intercom. Chen was already calculating burn rates and flight times, his experience evident in how quickly he processed the numbers. "We've got 40 minutes on station, maybe 45 if we keep the power settings conservative," he replied. It was cutting things close, but doable if everything went according to plan. Of course, nothing ever went according to plan in combat aviation. They both knew that margin for error was thin as paper, but Marines were counting on them. The radio crackled with an update from the forward air controller. "Nighthawk 7-7, this is Reaper 6. Latest intelligence shows heavy enemy movement in the extraction area. Multiple technicals, possible anti-aircraft systems. Be advised, this is getting sporty down here." The voice carried the strain of someone who'd been watching friends die while help remained frustratingly out of reach. Thorne keyed her mic. "Copy, Reaper 6. What's the status on our boys?" The question every pilot dreads asking, because the answer might be the one you can't live with. In the cabin behind her, Rodriguez and his crew checked their equipment one more time, understanding that they were flying into a situation where seconds would determine who lived and who became another casualty statistic. "Still breathing, but barely. They're down to their last magazines and the enemy's closing fast. You're their only chance, Nighthawk." The weight of responsibility settled onto Thorne's shoulders like lead blankets. 4 lives depending on her ability to thread an aircraft through hostile territory in deteriorating weather conditions. It was exactly the kind of mission that had made her reputation years ago. The storm intensified as they flew deeper into the mountains. Lightning illuminated towering cumulus clouds that rose like stone walls on either side of their flight path. Thorne reduced airspeed, trading speed for stability as turbulence began buffeting the aircraft. Chen monitored engine parameters, calling out any deviations that might indicate developing problems. 30 degrees right, Thorne announced, adjusting course to follow the GPS waypoint she'd programmed. The valley ahead looked like the throat of some ancient beast, narrow walls rising on both sides while the floor disappeared into shadows and weather. This was where Taliban fighters had been moving supplies for months, where American aircraft became targets the moment they entered the funnel of death. Rodriguez's voice came through the intercom with professional calm. 5 minutes to target area, crew chiefs ready. Behind him, Williams and Jackson chambered rounds in their machine guns, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether they all went home or became another memorial service at the base chapel. Thorne's hands remained steady on the controls despite the growing turbulence. She'd flown through worse weather, but never with so much personal redemption riding on the outcome. Tonight, Nighthawk would either prove she still belonged in the cockpit or confirm every doubt the review board had harbored about her judgment and capability. The valley walls seemed to close around them as they descended through the corridor between life and death. Lightning strobed across the cockpit as they entered the valley proper, illuminating terrain that looked like photographs from another planet. Jagged ridges rose on both sides, their peaks disappearing into the storm clouds that roiled overhead like smoke from a massive fire. Thorne flew by instruments now, the outside world reduced to brief glimpses between lightning strikes and sheets of rain that hammered the windscreen like bullets. "Radar contact, 2 o'clock ground level," Chen announced, his voice tight with concentration. The screen showed multiple returns that could be vehicles, buildings, or just terrain features distorted by weather. In this valley, everything was potentially hostile until proven otherwise. Thorne adjusted course slightly, keeping the aircraft in the center of the narrow passage while maintaining altitude that would give them maneuvering room if they took fire. The radio burst with frantic transmissions from the trapped Marines. Any station, this is Bravo 4-1. We are taking heavy fire from multiple directions. Request immediate assistance." The voice belonged to a young sergeant who sounded like he was aging years with every passing minute. Behind his words, automatic weapons fire created a deadly percussion that spoke of enemies closing fast. Thorne keyed her mic. "Bravo 4-1, this is Nighthawk 7-7 inbound your position. Hold tight, Marines. Cavalry's coming." Her voice carried confidence she didn't entirely feel, but leadership meant projecting strength even when your gut churned with uncertainty. These kids needed to believe help was coming, needed something to keep fighting for in the next few critical minutes. Roger Nighthawk, God, we thought nobody was coming. The relief in the Marine's voice was palpable, but Thorne knew relief was premature. Getting to them was only half the battle. Getting them out alive was the real test. She'd seen too many rescue attempts fail in the final moments when success seemed assured. Williams called out from his gun position. Movement at 10 o'clock, approximately 1,000 meters. Looks like vehicles. His trained eye had caught something in the lightning illuminated landscape below. Taliban forces were repositioning, trying to cut off any escape routes before the American rescue helicopter could extract their prey. The aircraft shuddered through another cell of turbulence, reminding everyone aboard that nature was as much their enemy tonight as the human fighters below. Thorne fought the controls, keeping them on course through air that felt like flying through liquid concrete. Chen monitored engine temperatures and hydraulic pressures, watching for any signs that the punishment was exceeding the aircraft's limits. 3 minutes to extraction point, Rodriguez announced, his crew preparing the cabin for what promised to be a chaotic pickup under fire. Medical supplies were secured, space cleared for casualties, weapons positioned to provide maximum coverage during the vulnerable moments when the helicopter would be stationary on the ground. Through the storm, muzzle flashes began appearing like deadly fireflies in the darkness. The Marines were still fighting, still holding their position against overwhelming odds. But ammunition was finite, and the enemy had more fighters than the defenders had bullets. Time was running out faster than fuel, and Nighthawk 7-7 was still 2 minutes from reaching the extraction zone. Thorne pushed the engines harder, trading fuel consumption for speed as she raced against time and Taliban reinforcements converging on 4 Americans who trusted her to keep them breathing. The valley walls seemed to press closer, as if the mountains themselves were conspiring to prevent the rescue. But Nighthawk had never met terrain she couldn't navigate or enemy she couldn't outmaneuver. Tonight wouldn't be different. She hoped. The extraction zone materialized through the storm like a vision from purgatory. Lightning revealed a small clearing surrounded by rocky outcrops that provided perfect cover for enemy fighters. Muzzle flashes sparked from multiple positions, creating a deadly light show that meant the Marines were still alive but barely hanging on. Thorne could see the tactical situation developing below. Defenders in the center, attackers closing from 3 sides like a tightening noose. Bravo 4-1, Nighthawk 7-7 has you visual. Pop smoke and mark your position, she transmitted while beginning her approach. The Blackhawk descended through turbulence that tried to throw them into the mountainside with each gust of wind. Chen called out altitude and airspeed, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Green smoke began billowing from the Marines' position, a beacon of hope in the darkness. But immediately, red smoke appeared from 2 other locations as enemy fighters tried to confuse the rescue attempt. Standard Taliban tactic: create multiple false landing zones to draw helicopters into kill zones prepared with RPGs and heavy weapons. "I've got the real smoke at 2 o'clock, Rodriguez called out, his experienced eye distinguishing between the Marines' signal and enemy deception. Years of combat deployments had taught him to read battlefields like topographic maps, understanding the subtle differences between friendly and hostile positions. Williams opened fire with his door gun, tracers reaching down like deadly fingers to suppress enemy positions threatening the landing zone. The sound of the machine gun filled the cabin, brass casings raining onto the deck as he walked fire across Taliban positions. Jackson joined the symphony of violence from the opposite door, creating overlapping fields of fire that forced enemy fighters to take cover. "Taking fire from the ridge line," Chen shouted as bullets sparked off the fuselage. The distinctive crack of AK-47s mixed with the deeper boom of RPG launches, creating a deadly orchestra that meant Taliban fighters had them bracketed. Thorn jinked the aircraft left, then right, trying to spoil enemy aim while maintaining approach to the landing zone. The clearing rushed up to meet them as Thorn flared the Blackhawk into landing attitude. Rotor wash created a whirlwind of dust and debris that provided some concealment, but also made it impossible to see potential threats. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability, when the helicopter became a stationary target that any competent fighter could destroy with a well-placed shot. "Marines moving to the aircraft," Rodriguez called out, watching four figures sprint across open ground toward salvation. Enemy fire intensified, bullets whining past the open doors as Taliban fighters realized their quarry was about to escape. One Marine stumbled, hit by enemy fire, but his teammates grabbed him under the arms and continued toward the helicopter without slowing. The crew chiefs laid down suppressive fire that kept enemy heads down during the critical seconds it took for the Marines to reach safety. Thorn held the aircraft steady despite every instinct screaming at her to lift off and escape the kill zone. Leaders stayed until everyone was aboard, no matter how many bullets filled the air around them. That's what separated the heroes from the survivors. Four bloodied Marines threw themselves into the cabin as Rodriguez hauled the wounded man aboard. "We're good. Go, go, go," he shouted over the intercom. Thorn pulled collective and the Blackhawk leaped skyward, climbing away from the deadly clearing just as an RPG streaked through the space they'd occupied seconds before. But they weren't safe yet. The hardest part was still ahead. The Blackhawk clawed for altitude as enemy fire continued reaching up from the darkness below. Thorn flew an evasive pattern that traded precious fuel for survival, jinking left and right to spoil the aim of Taliban fighters who'd positioned themselves along the expected escape route. The aircraft shuddered as bullets found their mark, but the armored fuselage held together under the punishment. In the cabin, Rodriguez worked frantically to stabilize the wounded Marine while his teammates provided covering fire from the open doors. Blood covered the deck plates, mixing with brass casings and hydraulic fluid that leaked from damaged lines. The smell of cordite and fear filled the confined space as everyone understood they weren't clear yet. "Fuel state critical," Chen announced, his instruments showing consumption rates that left no margin for error. The extended hover under fire had burned through their reserves, leaving barely enough to reach friendly territory. It would be a race between empty tanks and safe landing zones, with no room for navigational errors or mechanical failures. Williams spotted the threat first. "Sam, launch, 6 o'clock." His warning came just as the missile's infrared signature bloomed on the aircraft's threat warning system. Thorn immediately deployed flares and chaff while throwing the helicopter into a diving turn that pushed the engines to their limits. The surface-to-air missile streaked past, missing by mere feet as it chased the decoy flares instead of the helicopter's engine heat. The wounded Marine, barely conscious, grabbed Rodriguez's arm. "My boys, did we get them all?" His voice barely carried over the engine noise, but the question revealed everything about the man's character. Even bleeding and barely alive, he was concerned about his team rather than himself. Rodriguez nodded, understanding that sometimes lies served mercy better than truth. "Everyone's aboard, Marine. You did good." The crew chief's words carried weight earned through years of combat rescues. He'd seen the best and worst of human nature, knew that courage often wore unexpected faces. Tonight, 4 Marines had held impossible odds long enough for rescue to arrive. That kind of heroism deserved recognition, even if the only witness was a bleeding helicopter crew chief. Thorn fought the controls as hydraulic pressure continued dropping, making the aircraft increasingly difficult to fly. They were still 15 minutes from base, flying through weather that challenged even undamaged helicopters. But failure wasn't an option now, not with 4 Marines depending on her to complete the mission she'd started in that coffee-scented briefing room. Tower, Nighthawk 7-7 declaring emergency. 4 souls on board requiring immediate medical attention. she transmitted as the base appeared through the storm like a constellation of hope. Emergency vehicles were already positioning on the flight line, medical teams prepared to receive casualties who'd been written off hours earlier. The landing felt like controlled crash as Thorne fought failing hydraulics to set the helicopter down without killing everyone aboard. But she managed it, using every bit of skill acquired through thousands of flight hours to cushion their descent onto the concrete pad. Medical personnel swarmed the aircraft before the rotors stopped turning, carrying wounded Marines towards surgery and survival. As the engine spooled down, Thorne sat in her seat, hands trembling slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. She'd done it, brought them all home alive. But more importantly, she'd proven something to herself and everyone who doubted her capabilities. Nighthawk was back. The debriefing room filled with an unusual energy as Thorne recounted the mission details to intelligence officers who normally dealt with routine patrol reports. Tonight, they were documenting something extraordinary, a rescue mission that had succeeded against overwhelming odds, performed by a pilot who'd been grounded for 6 months due to questionable judgment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Captain Morrison sat at the head of the table, studying the preliminary damage assessment reports. 17 bullet holes in the fuselage, hydraulic system compromised, engine housing cracked from overtemperature conditions. By all rights, Nighthawk 77 should have become another aircraft loss statistic, added to the growing list of helicopters destroyed by enemy action in Afghanistan's unforgiving mountains. "Walk me through the decision to use the secondary approach route," Morrison requested, his tone professional but carrying undertones of genuine curiosity. He'd reviewed the flight plan, understood the tactical situation, but wanted to hear Thorne's reasoning from her own perspective. Sometimes the difference between success and failure lay in split-second decisions that couldn't be captured in after-action reports. Thorne consulted her notes, though memory of those critical moments remained crystal clear. The primary route was compromised before we arrived. Too many muzzle flashes, too much coordinated fire. Taliban had been waiting for exactly this scenario. Her explanation carried the matter-of-fact tone of someone analyzing chess moves rather than life-and-death decisions made under fire. Chief Rodriguez entered the room, still wearing his blood-stained flight suit. His presence added weight to the proceedings. Crew chiefs were the backbone of aviation units, experienced professionals who'd seen enough missions to separate competent pilots from exceptional ones. Tonight, his assessment would carry more influence than any official evaluation. "How did the crew perform?" Morrison asked, though Rodriguez's expression already suggested the answer. The crew chief had served multiple combat tours, flown with dozens of aircraft commanders ranging from barely competent to genuinely gifted. His opinion would help determine whether tonight's success represented skillful flying or dangerous luck. "Sir, I've been flying for 12 years, 4 combat deployments. I've never seen anything like what Lieutenant Thorne did tonight." Rodriguez's words carried absolute conviction. She put that bird exactly where it needed to be, when it needed to be there, despite weather conditions that should have grounded us and enemy fire that should have killed us all. The intelligence officer looked up from his computer. Preliminary casualty reports show 37 enemy KIA, significant equipment losses. The Marines' position was overrun approximately 10 minutes after extraction. The numbers painted a stark picture. Without Thorne's intervention, 4 Americans would have died in that valley, their sacrifice adding to the war's mounting toll. Morrison nodded slowly, processing information that would reshape his understanding of the pilot sitting across from him. 6 months ago, a review board had questioned her judgment, suggested she took unnecessary risks that endangered aircrew and passengers. Tonight, those same risk-taking instincts had saved 4 lives that would otherwise be added to the memorial wall. "Lieutenant Thorne," he said formally, "pending final investigation, your return to full flight status effective immediately." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. They represented vindication for a pilot who'd spent months wondering if her career was over, if one controversial mission would overshadow years of exemplary service. Thorne felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she'd carried for so long it had become part of her identity. "Thank you, sir." Simple words that couldn't express the relief of knowing she belonged in cockpits again, that Nighthawk was free to soar whenever Marines needed extraction from impossible situations. Outside, dawn was breaking over the mountains, painting peaks pink and gold. It was going to be a beautiful day for flying. Word of the rescue spread through the base like wildfire, carried by ground crews, medical personnel, and Marines who understood they'd witnessed something exceptional. Thorne found herself surrounded by aircrew members who wanted to hear first-hand accounts of flying through a storm that had grounded every other pilot on base. Their questions revealed professional curiosity, mixed with genuine respect for someone who'd accomplished the impossible. Warrant Officer Chen appeared at the maintenance hangar where Thorne was inspecting battle damage to their helicopter. The aircraft looked like it had been through a meat grinder, bullet holes stitched across the fuselage, hydraulic lines damaged, engine cowlings cracked from over-temperature operation. Any one of these failures could have ended the mission catastrophically, yet they'd brought everyone home alive. "Heard the Marines are putting you up for a Silver Star," Chen mentioned casually, though his eyes held newfound respect. Flying with Thorne had changed his perspective on courage and capability. He'd always been a competent co-pilot, but tonight had shown him the difference between competence and excellence, between following procedures and making impossible things happen through sheer force of will. Thorne ran her hand along a bullet hole that had missed the main transmission by inches. "They're still breathing. That's reward enough." Her response carried typical pilot understatement, but Chen recognized the satisfaction in her voice. Some missions were about completing objectives. Others were about proving fundamental truths about who you are when everything depends on your performance. Sergeant Williams approached with his door gun disassembled for cleaning, the weapon bearing scorch marks from the extended firefight. "Ma'am, wanted to thank you for getting us home. I've flown with a lot of pilots, but I've never seen flying like that." His words represented the ultimate aircrew endorsement. Door gunners trusted their lives to pilot skill, and Williams had watched Thorne thread their helicopter through conditions that would have defeated lesser aviators. The base chaplain arrived as news reached him about Marines who'd survived against impossible odds. Father Mackenzie had performed too many memorial services, offered comfort to too many families destroyed by war's cruel mathematics. Tonight represented the rare exception, a story about Americans coming home alive when every tactical assessment suggested they wouldn't see another sunrise. "Lieutenant, those boys wanted me to give you this," he said, handing her a small piece of paper. Thorne unfolded it to find a simple message written in a Marine's crude handwriting. "Thank you for not giving up on us. Semper Fi. Bravo 4-1." The note represented something more valuable than any official commendation, recognition from warriors who understood the difference between duty and heroism. As she stood in the hangar surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by one night's mission, Thorne realized that redemption didn't come through bureaucratic reinstatement or official vindication. It came through moments when your actions aligned with your deepest beliefs about right and wrong, when the person you'd always believed yourself to be finally emerged from beneath layers of doubt and institutional judgment. The helicopter behind her would fly again after repairs, ready for the next impossible mission. And when that call came, Nighthawk would be ready to answer, carrying coffee or carrying Marines, whatever the mission required. Some birds never truly forget how to fly. They just wait for the right moment to spread their wings and remind the world what they're capable of accomplishing when lives hang in the balance and failure isn't acceptable. 3 weeks after the rescue, Thorne found herself back in the same briefing room where everything had changed. But this time, she wasn't delivering coffee. She was briefing a mission profile to a room full of pilots who now looked at her with undisguised respect rather than polite dismissal. The transformation in their attitudes represented something more significant than professional recognition. It marked the resurrection of a reputation that had been buried under months of administrative doubt. Major Phillips, the same officer who'd questioned her judgment weeks earlier, now deferred to her tactical assessments with visible deference. Combat had a way of clarifying who could perform under pressure and who merely looked good in briefing rooms. Thorne had proven herself in the crucible that separated actual warriors from those who simply wore uniforms and collected paychecks. The primary challenge will be weather again, she explained, pointing to meteorological data showing another storm system approaching the operational area. But we've proven these conditions are manageable with proper planning and execution. Her confidence wasn't arrogance. It was the earned assurance of someone who'd faced nature's worst and emerged victorious. Lieutenant Morrison had been promoted to major after successfully managing multiple complex operations, including the rescue that had restored Thorne's career. His leadership style had evolved to recognize talent wherever it appeared, regardless of previous setbacks or bureaucratic complications. Good commanders learn to identify their best resources and deploy them effectively, even when those resources came with complicated histories. Nighthawk, you'll be primary on this extraction. Chen will co-pilot, Rodriguez will run the cabin crew. Morrison's assignment wasn't based on duty rotations or seniority. It was based on proven performance under conditions that challenged even experienced aircrew. When lives depended on mission success, you selected the team most capable of delivering impossible results. The intelligence briefing painted a familiar picture. Americans in trouble, enemy forces converging, weather conditions that challenged aircraft performance, time running short before tactical situations became untenable. It was the kind of scenario that had become Thorne's specialty, the impossible missions that required pilot skills pushed beyond normal operational limits. As the briefing concluded, Rodriguez approached with his characteristic professional bearing. "Ma'am, crew's ready when you are. Same team as last time." His words carried significance beyond their simple meaning. Combat aircrew formed bonds forged in shared danger, understanding that their survival depended on absolute trust in each other's competence and commitment to mission accomplishment. Chen appeared with updated weather data that showed conditions margin.